Welcome back. You're watching ET Inside. Fighting inflation is something central bankers do for a living. And most often, they do win. So why is it proving to be so difficult this time around? Earlier, I spoke with Dr. C. Rangarajan, Chairman of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, for some answers.
The Reserve Bank of India needs to continue its policy of tightening until the inflation rate begins to show definite signs of decline.
Right.
And I would leave it to the Reserve Bank to decide the magnitude. But I think the direction in which the Reserve Bank of India should go is very clear as far as I am concerned. And I believe that continued action on the part of the Reserve Bank will be necessary.
One school of thought says that maybe the RBI hasn't been aggressive enough. Maybe it's slightly behind the curve in terms of taming inflation. And that's possibly because of the calibrated 25 basis point increase which it has been making in the interest rate. Has RBI been a little too conservative in terms of rate hikes?
I think the RBI has been concerned also about the growth prospects. And it has taken the view and the approach to do it in a series of small steps. But so long as the Reserve Bank of India makes it very clear that it will continue with its policy until the inflation rate comes down to a more comfortable level, the magnitude of increase on specific occasions may not really matter. But I think what is really required would be for the Reserve Bank to be very explicit about the continued need for action until the inflation rate comes down to more reasonable levels.
So are you saying that if RBI had to pick between growth and inflation, which is the central bankers' quintessential dilemma every time, should they err on the side of maybe cooling inflation and sacrificing growth a bit?
I think the major concern of the central bank now should be to control inflation, because contrary to expectations, the inflation rate went up in the month of March, and therefore the need to control inflation has become more urgent. And I would therefore think that the priority of the Reserve Bank of India must now be to control inflation.
And Dr. Rangarajan, if you look at the inflation figures, until recently it was food and fuel which were driving the rates of inflation, but now it seems to be getting into non-food items as well. So inflation in some sense is becoming more generalized. Is that going to make the battle harder for RBI?
It is not going to make the battle harder. I think it only shows that the need for continued action on the part of the Reserve Bank. So long as it was driven by food prices, many people argued that it was a supply side problem and monetary authorities have no role to play. But that's a wrong approach to take, but nevertheless it was being argued. Now it has become very clear that it is not just confined to the food products. It has spread to the manufacturing sector. In fact, within the manufacturing sector, the non-food manufacturing inflation rate has touched 7%. And therefore, the demand pressures are definitely seen in the economy. And therefore, the need for action on the part of the central bank becomes undisputed.
And do you also worry that if the RBI were to be a little more aggressive with rate hikes, it will also hurt industrial sentiment, because we're already looking at industry scaling back on investment, cost of credit is going to go up for companies, and is there any risk of depressing growth over a longer term if RBI were to be slightly more aggressive?
No, I don't think so, because then the industry also must recognize that a period of continued high level of inflation is not conducive for industrial growth also. There may be some trade-off in the short run, but there is certainly no trade-off in the long run. And if you look at it not in terms of the current growth, but the future growth, it is absolutely essential that the control of inflation must take precedence at this particular point. And that therefore, in the interest of sustained long-term and medium-term industrial growth, we need to control inflation.
What would be your advice to the government to tackle this whole inflation issue in the long term?
Well, in the long term, the main thing is really to act on the supply side. On the supply side, both in relation to agricultural production and industrial production, we must maintain a reasonable rate of growth. As far as agriculture and allied activities are concerned, we are talking in terms of an annual growth rate of 4%. That, I think, is absolutely essential. The last 2 years have clearly shown that even a small shortfall in agricultural production can cause serious distortions to the economy. And therefore, both industrial and agricultural production must be maintained at a level which is consistent with the overall rate of growth of 9%. But on the demand side, I think what is really important is to ensure that the demand side pressures do not emanate from the fiscal side, so that the fiscal deficit is maintained at a reasonable level. And as far as monetary policy is concerned, the money supply growth is also kept at a level consistent with the overall rate of growth of the economy.
But do you think the Finance Ministry has the leeway to actually bring down fiscal deficit significantly this year?
Well, they have projected a fiscal deficit of 4.6% for the current year, and they should adhere to it, because that is in keeping with the medium-term goal of bringing the fiscal deficit of the center to 3% of the GDP by 2014-15. Therefore, the maintenance or ensuring the fiscal deficit at 4.6% of the GDP in the current year is extremely important. I do know there are some imponderables, uncertainties, but appropriate action must be taken during the year to reach this level of fiscal deficit.
Finally, sir, what is your forecast for inflation, let's say, till the end of this financial year?
Well, I think that inflation will start coming down from April, but will remain at a reasonably high level in the first 4 months of the current fiscal. But by March 2012, if the monsoon is normal, we should expect the inflation rate to be around 6.5%.
With that, it's a wrap on this edition of ET Insight. We'll be back next week, but until then, don't forget to write in with your feedback and suggestions. Thanks so much for watching.